Got it. Hi everybody. Welcome to tonight's meeting of Reasonable Faith Adelaide. My name is Tom Daly, and I want to welcome you to our meeting this evening, where we have a special guest, Ken Samples, presenting his talk on abductive reasoning and conspiracy theories. Ken is a philosopher and theologian and works as a senior research scholar at Reasons to Believe, an organisation that researches and communicates how God's revelation in the Bible harmonizes with science and philosophy and the real world around us. Ken focuses on demonstrating the unique compatibility of Christianity's great doctrinal truths with reason and logic. He's the author of several books, including Christianity Cross-Examined, Classic Christian Thinkers, and God Among Sages. He leads RTB's Reasons to Believe Straight Thinking podcast, and also writes a weekly blog called Reflections, exploring the Christian worldview. So welcome, Ken. Thanks for joining us. Please take it away and help us to reason together.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk for a little while about this topic of abductive reasoning and conspiracy theories. If anything that I say is something you'd like to ask a question about or come back for further discussion, then please make a note of it. And I look forward to an opportunity to talk with you further. Let me introduce the idea of abductive reasoning by kind of bringing you to a way of thinking. You know, suppose that on Saturday you're going to sleep in and, you start to wake up. You're not fully awake, but you're not yet fully asleep. You're kind of in that middle groggy period. So you wake up in the morning and you peek through the blinds and you see that the streets are wet. The question is, what would your natural and immediate inference to explain the wet streets? So, they may look like this, where there's water on the ground. Well, most of us would naturally and immediately infer abductively that rain caused the streets to be wet. Some people would propose that we are explanation-seeking creatures, that we just intuitively and naturally ask, how is that to be understood? How is it to be explained? And that's kind of the essence of abductive reasoning. Now, I like to point out that in my neighborhood on the second Tuesday of the month, there is a street sweeper that comes along that might wet the streets. But this idea, when we see something, we search our minds for an explanation of it. And so this idea of abduction, it goes along with other forms of reasoning and logic, like deduction and induction. Abduction kind of relates to more of a diagnostic way of thinking. Here's Peter Lipton's book, a British philosopher that talks about the inference to the best explanation. Often scientists use those terms quite frequently. And of course, abductive reasoning probably came to be out of the mind of an American philosopher, logician, mathematician, a scientist named Charles Saunders Peirce. He was a professor at Harvard, and he's credited with kind of developing an abductive form of reasoning. So drawing inferences concerning the best explanation, that would be why or how things are the case for various phenomena, is in logical terms called abductive reasoning. Now, again, most people are not so familiar with abductive thought. They've heard of deduction and induction, but abductive reasoning is sometimes a little bit new to them. I've even noticed that not all logic textbooks even have it, but I think it's a remarkable way of thinking. And in fact, I think it is ideal in terms of reasoning about Christianity. And later, when I give a presentation about C.S. Lewis, I'm going to say that I think C.S. Lewis was very fond of utilizing abductive reasoning. So as I mentioned, it's lesser known than deduction or induction. Abductive reasoning seeks to uncover the best explanation for a series of facts or a state of affairs. Sometimes you'll see the reference of IBE, again, inference to the best explanation. Abductive reasoning asks the specific question, what is the best explanation for the existence or nature of a given phenomenon? Unlike, now I'm going to contrast it with deduction and induction. Unlike deduction, abduction cannot provide certainty or conclusiveness in its conclusions. Moreover, abduction doesn't generally seek to predict future states of affairs like scientific induction, the hypothesis of scientific induction. Though some logicians view abduction as a specialized form of induction. In fact, here's a very popular logic text, I think both in America and in Britain. Logician Lewis Vaughan, in a new edition of his book, The Power of Critical Thinking, he views abduction as a specialized type of induction. According to abduction, the best explanation is one that is the most likely to be true. While explanations are not arguments, it is true that arguments often contain explanations. And though a unique characteristic of abductive reasoning is that it moves beyond the evidence in postulating an explanation that is not completely contained in the given facts or data themselves. The plausible, instead of conclusive or probable explanation, may combine both inference and imagination in accounting for that yet to be explained reality. Here's where C.S. Lewis fits in. Lewis is very fond of arguing in terms of both reason and imaginatively. And so abduction would emphasize what is plausible. And I think some of Lewis's most important arguments, like the argument from desire, and his argument about Jesus, who is Jesus, I think fits very well with an abductive form of reasoning. Sometimes in broader apologetics, this comes out as a cumulative case. If you think of a classical approach to apologetics, which is very much represented by William Lane Craig, you think of evidentialism of somebody like a Gary Habermas, this type of reasoning fits very well with a cumulative case approach. So here is just a comparison. A sound deductive argument produces certainly true conclusions, and those are wonderful. The challenge with deduction is it has limited application. Cogent inductive arguments produce probably true conclusions. Inductive arguments have greater application than deduction, but they have less certainty. And then third, a viable abductive argument produces plausibly true conclusions. And again, is based upon the idea of trying to find out what the best explanation is. Abduction also provides its own criteria of testing alternative explanations by suggesting that the better ones exhibit coherence, simplicity, explanatory power and scope, correspondence, and competitive competence. Here's kind of an outline of how you would go about testing. Again, any kind of argument has to be coherent. It has to be internally consistent. The idea of a contradiction would make the argument fail immediately. Simplicity, where you would ask, a good explanation would have a broad ability to explain, but it would also remain simple, kind of add an appeal to Occam's razor there, if you will. Explanatory power and scope, that's I think a very powerful way of reasoning for Christianity. People like Richard Swinburne reasoned that way, that God, that Christian theism, that historic Christianity provides an explanation for many of the meaningful realities of life. Correspondence, it meshes well with established truth. And then competition, it adjusts to new data, responding to reasonable challenges and stands superior to alternative theories. So the idea there is that if you haven't considered all the evidence, and that would include evidence against your position potentially, then you haven't really looked at all the evidence. And so this would be a way of kind of testing whether an abductive argument is genuinely viable. Now, the question is just who uses abductive reasoning? And I think that the answer is that everyone who offers a diagnosis. A diagnosis would be the investigation or analysis of the cause or nature of a condition, situation, or problem. So anybody who is engaged in a diagnostician would fit in the category of abductive reasoning. So this would include logicians, it would include philosophers, detectives, historians, physicians. When I see my doctor, I often have questions about his diagnosis. I'll ask him, well, when you go about diagnosing the problem with the patient, how much of that is based upon, the symptoms that your patient has? How much of it is based upon your experience? I said, is there kind of an educated guessing that goes on? And so my doctor's kind of used to me kind of interrogating him philosophically about how he engages in reasoning. But I'm very interested in how people in various fields, how they think and reason. Scientists use abductive reasoning, particularly when they develop hypotheses. Engineers, of course, use it. My father was a soldier in the Second World War. After the war, he became a truck and car mechanic. And my dad was kind of a troubleshooter. When they had a difficulty with an engine, they would bring him in. And I remember as a young boy, my dad, he liked to try to help people, particularly some of the women who had lost their husbands. And so my dad would have the women come over and he would tune up their car for them. That was the way he felt that he could help them. And I remember these ladies, they'd pull the car into our driveway and my dad would open in the hood and he would just listen to the engine. And then he would say, oh yeah, that's a carburetor problem, or that's a transmission problem. And when I was a boy, I thought, wow, my dad is like a shaman. He can just, who could possibly listen to an engine and give a diagnosis? Well, my dad wasn't a shaman. My dad was, he'd been around the internal combustion engine for a good bit of his life. He'd seen lots of cars, and he was really kind of operating abductively. He was trying to draw the best explanation, because an engine, analogically, in terms of an analogy, it's kind of like it has symptoms, just as a human being who might go to their doctor. So very thoughtful people reason abductively, and some of them are not even aware that this is a unique form of reasoning. So abduction is a normal and natural way of reasoning. It reflects the very thinking of diagnosticians. And again, detectives, or crime scene investigators, they move from evidence to a theory. Historians, facts to explanation. Scientists, data to a hypothesis. Physicians, symptoms to a diagnosis. Someone like my dad, who was a mechanic, a problem to a solution. A book addressing the abductive inference states that this form of reasoning, quote, occurs in such diverse places as medical diagnosis, scientific theory formation, accident investigation, language understanding, and even jury deliberation. And here is a very popular book by John and Susan Josephson. Notice the title, Abductive Inference, Computation, Philosophy, and Technology. So anyone who is engaged in diagnostic thinking would be involved in abductive thought. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take this, because abductive reasoning is looking at what is the best explanation. I'd like to attempt to apply this to conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories are typically alternative explanations for things. In fact, Merriam-Webster defines a conspiracy theory as, quote, a theory that explains an event or a set of circumstances as the result of a secret plot or unusually powerful conspirators. So conspiracy theories are offering an explanation. It is a non-standard explanation. It is an explanation that people think is not your traditional explanation. And so conspiracy theories, in my view, they never really seem to go away, especially ones that are said to involve clandestine plots of the United States government. Maybe you might want to apply that to Australian government or the British government, that there are these plots behind the scene. It seems that many Americans believe high-level members of the federal government have been involved in such things as assassinations, cover-ups, and secret societies. Conspiracy theories, like all theories, need to be thought through critically and dispassionately. As Christians, we have a duty to pursue the truth. However, in a fallen world, truth's not always easy to discern. And I think conspiracy theories are increasing in many respects. Nevertheless, as creatures made in the image of God, we possess the ability to reason through explanations both carefully and discover the truth. And I hope to illustrate this in the consideration of conspiracy theories. Now, let's look at 4 big conspiracy theories. You've heard of these covert plots, the ones involving the United States government, Australian government, the British government, maybe the Russian government, the Chinese government. Here are 4 such conspiracy theories that have gained popular acceptance among many Americans over the decades. And of course, the number one right at the top is the Jfk Assassination Conspiracy Theory, widely considered the greatest conspiracy theory of all time. A Gallup poll taken in 2001 reported that 81% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy behind the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. I remember that day. I was only 5 years old. I remember my mother crying. I remember my dad coming home from work. And I remember there was no television programs for 4 days except for coverage of Kennedy's assassination. Of course, C.S. Lewis died on the very same day, but in America, we didn't know that for a couple of weeks because all of the news was about the assassination of President Kennedy. I remember, too, watching television. We had a little black and white TV in those days. It had rabbit ears on top. Technology has grown a lot in the last 60 years. But I remember my mother, my dad and I were watching TV. We're getting ready to go to Mass. We attended a Catholic church. And I remember Lee Oswald was brought down into the jail to be transferred. And Jack Ruby reached out with a pistol and shot Lee Oswald dead on live television. And I remember my parents were perplexed by this event. My parents were Kennedy Democrats. They had supported Kennedy in the 1960 election. And so we were very much followers of the new president. Well, though by 2018, the number had dropped to 60%, from 81 to 61, or to 60. As the decades pass without verification of an actual conspiracy, I expect the numbers to continue to drop. Some of the most common, highly speculative scenarios propose that top officials of the American government engaged in a coup d'etat to murder President Kennedy. And maybe the best example of conspiracy theory regarding John F. Kennedy is the movie maker Oliver Stone. His book JFK that came out in 1991. I remember watching it, and my conclusion was everybody but Oswald killed Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson had a hand in it. Richard Nixon had a hand in it. The CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service. And so I concluded, wow, that was quite a conspiracy. Now, another conspiracy theory that is, I think, rekindled over the last couple years is UFO conspiracy theories. In 2021, a Gallup poll said that 40% of all US citizens believe that real spacecrafts are visiting Earth from distant places in the universe. So this would be the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that there are literal metallic crafts traversing space and coming to Earth. Additionally, in 2019, a Gallup poll says 2/3 of Americans believe that the US government hasn't revealed all that it knows about the UFO phenomenon. The US military report of UAPs, instead of UFOs, they are now referred to as unidentified aerial phenomena, in June of 2021 brought the UFO topic back into discussion. And of course, the American military reported to the American Congress that they believed that there was a reality of UFOs or UAPs, but they were uncertain as to what they were. They hadn't ruled out that they might be Russian, they might be Chinese, they may be something other, but they weren't able to define it. A third conspiracy theory that continues to grow is the 9/11 conspiracy theory. In a 2016 article in Live Science, a popular science online magazine, notes that Americans believe that the US government was involved in events concerning 9/11. Conspiracy theorists are called truthers, and they claim that high-level members of the Bush administration either participated in or did nothing to stop the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And so this has continued to grow. And I have something to say about conspiracy theories and how they develop, but I'm going to hold on to that. I want to get through a little bit more here. A fourth conspiracy theory that's been around a very long time is what I would call the secret society theory. Popular belief in the US and around the world is that a select group of people who are part of a clandestine societies control the world. Allegedly, these shadowy people are wealthy and well-connected politically and are part of a fraternal organization that controls events around the world for their own benefit. And so this has been around a long time. You see it in Europe, you see it in America, you see it in various places. In the 1930s, the Nazis set forth the conspiracy theory that the Jews were the puppet masters behind communism and had manipulated the money markets in Europe to cause societal unrest in the 1930s. It's interesting to me that if you read Mein Kampf, if you read some of the analysis by various Nazis, they point out that many ideas that Hitler had were largely conspiratorial theories. The popular author Dan Brown, in his 2009 novel, The Lost Symbol, weaves a story about secret fraternal organizations in early America and how their rituals and symbols have deeply influenced history. This often is tied to the Catholic Church. It's tied to very powerful individuals. Now, those are what I call the big four, but there are others. In 2016, Live Science article reveals the following about popular conspiracy theories. The government is concealing what they know about not only the 9/11 attacks, 54.3% agree or strongly agree. Of course, the granddaddy, the JFK assassination, 49.6%. Alien encounters, 42.6%. Global warming, 42.1%. Plans for a one world government, 32.9%. Obama's birth certificate, which was a controversy during the time of his presidency, and President Trump later was an advocate of that perspective, the origins of the AIDS virus, the death of the Supreme Court Justice Anton Scalia, and even the moon landing, 24.2%. There is a very interesting video on YouTube where Buzz Aldrin, who of course was one of the astronauts to land on the moon July 20th, 1969, and he's confronted by somebody who denies it. And he comes up to Buzz Aldrin, who is well into his 80s, and says, you lied about all of this. You're a deceiver. And Buzz Aldrin tries to get away from him, and this guy pursues him. And then finally, Buzz Aldrin punches him in the nose. It is quite an issue because there's a real funny story. I have a colleague that works with me on the Straight Thinking podcast, Dr. Dave Rogstad. He is a physicist, and he worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory run by NASA in Southern California. And he was at a conference, and one of the leaders of NASA came out and said, yeah, we wanted to fake the moon landing, but we found that we'd have to pay more money to Hollywood people, so we decided to go there anyway. So that's a little bit of humor there. Now, there are let me see if I got to the right place here. Yes. Now, a couple very recent conspiracy theories. In 2020, a Pew Research report says 25% of Americans believe a powerful group of people intentionally planned the COVID-19 coronavirus. Yeah. The Kaiser Family Foundation released a 2021 study that revealed that about half of the unvaccinated adults in America believe getting vaccinated was a bigger risk to their health than getting infected with the coronavirus. And of course, there are people who suggest that they may be putting things within the body of people through vaccinations, or that these vaccinations are deeply harmful. And of course, during during this challenging time, lots of people have raised questions about how the United States government handled it. I'm sure similar questions were raised in Australia and around the world. Now, what do we do with these conspiracy theories? How do we explain them? One of the things that I want to address is, why do these alternative explanations remain popular? And I think there are a few reasons we can identify. One is that sometimes conspiracy theories prove, in fact, to be true. History indicates that people have plotted to carry out illegal, subversive, secret plans. For example, it was proven in a court of law that a small group of individuals conspired to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. So conspiracies do happen. Also, members of the US government are not immune from the possibility of engaging in conspiracies. Former President Richard Nixon, by the way, whose boyhood home is here in California. He was a congressman from California before he became vice president, and then later president. So former President Richard Nixon later acknowledged that he knew much more about the Watergate break-in, than he initially expressed. So conspiracy theories, even those involving the American government, should not be rejected a priori, that is, prior to reasonable analysis. It's possible that sometimes these conspiracies are true. I think a second reason conspiracy theories remain popular, I think that they're popular because as human beings, our knowledge is limited. I mean, we are finite. We're temporal creatures. We have limitations, and there are things that we don't know, and sometimes it bothers us. This is, in philosophical terms, an epistemological challenge. There are things that are outside of our capacity to know, and so we like to speculate. A third one, and I think that this is a very important part of understanding conspiracies. Conspiracies can serve to, quote, even things out, close quote. It's hard to balance how a person as inconsequential as Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, could murder someone as consequential as President John F. Kennedy. But a clandestine conspiracy involving powerful figures would help even the odds in an otherwise implausible scenario. I've spent a lot of time reading about the assassination of President Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald was making $1.25 at the Book Depository building. He was a troubled person. I would describe Lee Oswald as being very similar to many of the people that engage in the school shootings. They're troubled psychologically. They're not unintelligent. Oswald was an intelligent person, but emotionally troubled. But he knew how to pull a trigger. He was trained as a marksman by the United States Marine Corps, and so here you have Oswald, who's a nobody. And then you have the most important man in the world, because during the time of the Cold War, the president of the United States wasn't just America's president. He was the leader of the free world. And I mean, if you look at the Holocaust, at least on one side, you had the world's greatest crime, the Holocaust, 6 million Jews murdered, millions of others murdered as well, Slavs, Russians, Poles, etc. But at least on the other side, you have the Nazis, who are this evil power. So there's kind of a balance. But then you go to the Kennedy assassination, and you've got this inconsequential Oswald. And on the other side, you have the ultimate consequential president. A conspiracy, I think, helps to even things out. And then 4, people enjoy speculating about grand enigmas. Conspiracy theories give them the opportunity to do that. I think it's something we like to do. And so those are some of my reasons for thinking about it. Now, how do I apply abductive reasoning to conspiracy theories? Yet most conspiracy theories, particularly the big ones like the JFK assassination, they haven't received the critical analysis they deserve by the American populace. I would propose some logic can be helpful here. And remember, I've already acknowledged that conspiracies can happen. And governments have a tendency to cover up. I think in the Cold War, America thought that, they had received reports of flying saucers, UFOs, and they were very concerned that they needed to protect American space. And so the government often thinks that it has priorities to keep things secret from its people. Abductive arguments, again, attempt to arrive at the best explanation for an event or a given series of facts. Now, I have 6 questions that I like to ask when somebody affirms a conspiracy theory. And I think that it's helpful to put them in the form of a question, rather than say to the person, you're not very careful in your thinking, or, you're holding a crazy idea. I think it's better to just lay out a question and help them to see why this question is significant and how they might go about answering it. Let me take a sip of water here. So let's talk about these questions. My first question is, how many people would have to know about the scheme in order to effectively pull off the subversion? How many people would have to be in on it? How many individuals would have to be on the inside? Now think about the Kennedy assassination. I think it's reasonable to conclude that the Secret Service would probably have to be involved. It could be higher up. Lyndon Johnson is often blamed for wanting to kill President Kennedy. I don't know, would the CIA have to know? Would the Dallas Police Department have to know? Of course, when you start to add to that, or the 9/11, how many people would have to be in on the fix? Would you have to, would George Bush and his people have to know? Would the government officials? Now, here's the idea. It just seems common sense that if a large number of people are involved in a conspiracy, to wonder if the silence of all the participants could be safeguarded. Could all the people be sufficiently paid off to guarantee that nothing would ever leak out? There would always be the possibility of people having a crisis of conscience, and some may even stand to gain a great deal of money by being a whistleblower on one of the most remarkable conspiracies in history. So it seems reasonable to conclude that the more people who know about the conspiracy, the greater chance someone's going to reveal the secret. Or as one of America's founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, once said, 3 men can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Now, Vincent Bugliosi, who was a trial attorney here in Los Angeles for many years, he tried 106 cases and won 105. After he retired, by the way, he prosecuted the Manson family. Bugliosi later wrote a book about the Kennedy assassination. It's 1,600 pages long. And then there's a whole other notes that go along with it. He jokingly one day said, "Where did all the people meet to plan the Kennedy assassination? Madison Square Garden?" This is the question. If you have a conspiracy involving a large number of people, it's hard to ensure that all of them will keep the secret. Logical problems like this apply to all big government conspiracy theories that require the involvement of great numbers of people, like the JFK assassination and the 9/11 truthers controversy. Question number 2, does the theory hold together foundationally? That's a good logical question. Well-conceived theories are logically sound and internally consistent. Viable explanatory theories avoid self-stultification or being self-defeating in nature, that is, contradictory by both affirming and denying essential elements of the same theory. Genuine contradictions in a system are a sign that the theory is wrong. An acceptable explanatory theory must possess logical coherence. Now, a couple ideas here for you. With regard to the 9/11 truthers, what I find very interesting, and this is a theory that I'm floating to you. I think that conspiracy theories sometimes need something to happen where people begin to raise question about the government. For example, the Kennedy conspiracy really didn't get going until things went wrong in Vietnam. When people began to question the American government's handling of the Vietnam War, more and more people then said, well, if they're lying about that, maybe they're lying about the Kennedy assassination. Here's another example. The truthers' 9/11 conspiracy didn't really get going until things went wrong with the Iraq War. And people began saying, look, the government is not legitimate. They are not being straightforward. They're lying to us about these issues. And then people began to say, well, maybe we're not getting the straight scoop about 9/11. Now here is, I think, a conceivable contradiction. Many people were very critical of George Bush. They thought he was essentially incompetent. He should never have been president. And look what he did, messing up, starting a war, looking for weapons of mass destruction that were not there. So on one hand, they said, this is maybe the most incompetent president America has ever had. But on the other hand, he's so shrewd, he planned the inside job of the 9/11. Well, which is it? Is he incompetent or is he a mastermind? These, I think, are questions that we can simply ask. A third question, does the theory comport with the facts, right? I think this is a really good question. Good theories are closely connected to the facts. They not only correspond to the known facts, but they make sense of the facts by tying them together in a coherent explanatory fashion. As American founding father John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. I love that. I like to say the laws of logic are stubborn things. They force us to pay attention. So failing to account for the facts can show a theory to be unacceptable. Before I look at number 4, facts. In the book depository building the same day, they discovered a sniper's nest. There were 3 cartridges that were found on the 6th floor. They also found a Mannlicher Carcano Italian carbine. It had Oswald's palm print on it. Oswald was the only employee of the book depository that was missing after the Dallas Police Department came. There was a description of Oswald. He later was arrested after shooting a policeman, and even when he was captured in a movie theater, he pulled out a gun and tried to shoot one of the policemen. The policeman's skin near his thumb got into the hammer, or Oswald would have murdered another policeman. Well, these are facts, and Vincent Bugliosi, in his book, he mentions 53 pieces of evidence that point toward Oswald's guilt. Well, maybe few of these facts may not fit, but you have to look at the facts. You have to be careful that you don't create things that are not factual. Now, how about a fourth one? Does the theory avoid unwarranted presumptions? There's a huge difference between presuming to know something and in fact knowing something. Good theories keep assumptions to a minimum, and if assumptions are made, they're shown to be plausible. You have to be careful about what you assume. And if you do assume something, then take ownership over it. I think when I talk with atheists, I ask them, what are your basic assumptions? What are you starting upon? What are you assuming to be true? Here's my assumptions. Are my assumptions plausible or reasonable? I think there are a lot of assumptions when it comes to conspiracy theories. And I think that's a good question to raise with people. Genuine knowledge includes proper justification for one's true beliefs. Solid theories are based upon that which can be proved or verified. Too many unwarranted assumptions can doom a theory. Question number 5. How well does the theory handle counter evidence and viable challenges? When I teach at Biola University, and let's say I teach an ethics course, I'll have the students write on an ethical issue. Maybe they'll choose abortion. Maybe they'll choose, a just war theory, or they'll choose euthanasia. And I say, look, I want you to develop your case. I want you to make your case. But then I want you to tell me what the very best argument is on the other side. And I want you to identify that best argument and then tell me how you would respond to it. A lot of times I have students come to me and say, I didn't know that there really was another argument on the other side, and it's actually pretty good. I like to say that you haven't considered all the evidence if you haven't considered evidence that would go against your position. So, feasible theories are flexible enough to accommodate possible counter evidence. The most potent explanatory theories carefully consider the best critiques from alternative perspectives and can answer the challenges. A good theory is where you make a case and you're able to respond to viable challenges that people raise. Now, my sixth, let me say one more word and then I'll go to our sixth question. Having a sufficient rebuttal is important in defending an argument and a broad theory. Careful thinking, however, demands that a person fairly consider viable alternatives. Unfortunately, too often, many of the people who accept the four big conspiracies have not done so. And here's number six, and I think that this may be the most powerful question. Is the theory, at least theoretically, open to falsification? And if so, how? Viable explanatory theories largely make claims that can be tested and proved true or false, verified or falsified. Non-falsifiable claims that cannot be investigated, evaluated, and critiqued, they tend to carry little rational weight. So what would have to happen for the conspiracy theory to be shown false? Now, I've talked with a good number of people who hold conspiracy theories. I've been interviewed on radio and debates with people on conspiracy theories. And very seldom do I come across a person who holds a big conspiracy theory who can actually identify for me how their theory would be falsified. Often a person might just blurt out, "I know it's true. There's no way that it can be false." And I think it's good for, this is good science. Science is deeply involved in looking at models and testing models and trying to falsify them. I think that conspiracy theories that are common in our culture, and that includes Christians, because Christians are sometimes taken in by fanciful conspiracy theories. Christians may be susceptible to big government conspiracy theories because they believe there's an invisible, malevolent hand at work behind the scenes of the world. We believe that is part of our theology. We believe there is an angelic realm. We believe there has been an angelic rebellion. The New Testament says the whole world lies in the lap of the evil one. So there are forces we can't see. Also, many Christians affirm an eschatology that involves a one world government in the end times. Like all people, Christians need to be discerning when it comes to conspiracy theories. So as I've attempted to demonstrate above, an important starting point when thinking about conspiracy theories is asking the appropriate tough-minded questions. I have a number of books that apply in one way or another. A World of Difference looks at logic. 7 Truths That Change the World looks at how Christians evaluate some of these things. I have a book entitled Christian Endgame, where we look at eschatology. My most recent book is Christianity Cross-Examined, where we explore certain things. I teamed up with Hugh Ross, who is an astronomer, and Mark Clark, who is a national security expert. And we wrote a book entitled Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, subtitle A Rational Christian Look at UFOs and Extraterrestrials. I think that we're going to put out a second edition of that book. God Among Sages, where I compare Jesus and the world's religions. And then 2 early books that I wrote in my career. I have gone to some of the major places in the world where people have claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary. And one of my former colleagues, Elliot Miller, we wrote a book, The Cult of the Virgin, Catholic Mariology and the Apparitions of Mary. And I also participated in a book about another conspiracy theory, and that is the way the US government handled David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. That became very controversial. The standoff, the 51-day standoff, the FBI sending tanks in. And by the way, the individual that blew up the federal building in Oklahoma, he was there in Waco, and so America has a long history of these types of things. Tom and Kevin, I'm going to stop here. That is a lot of ideas and a lot of points, and I am more than happy to try to field your questions or your comments, and I'd be happy to kind of respond to anything you'd like to talk about.
Wow, thank you very much, Ken. I've actually heard you give variations of this talk before, but that was, for me at least, that was intriguing. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Look, what we normally do here is we go through the chat and then we sort of open it for a bit of a, if there's anything in the chat that needs addressing, and I think there are. And so, Brian, do you want to?
Excuse me, Tom. It might be an idea if Ken stops sharing so we can actually go into gallery view.
Oh, there we go. Thanks, Ken.
Sure.
So, Brian, do you want to talk about your question first?
Yes, although first I'll say something else I was thinking right at the end. Ken, what you said, as you kind of intimated, did go for quite a while, but it sounded like just a bare introduction to the subject. Sounded like you could have gone on for another 24 hours or so on the same thing.
Well, I'll tell you, I am kind of obsessive compulsive about certain things. I've been studying the Kennedy assassination for about 40 years off and on. And I've been fascinated. I'll tell you that there was two conspiracies I did buy into as a young person. I was a big Beatles fan in the 1960s. And there was a conspiracy. It said that Paul McCartney had been killed in an automobile crash, and they had found a lookalike who had replaced Paul. And so the theory was that on one of the records, if you played it backwards, John said, "I bury Paul." So I was looking at all my Beatle albums, looking for clues, and I discovered that that was bogus. I also, for a while, considered the Bermuda Triangle conspiracy theory, and I read Van Doniken's the book
Chariots
that
of the
he
Gods.
had, Chariots of the Gods. And so I've always been interested in these questions. And then once becoming a professor of logic, I thought, wow, this is really fun to kind of look through these ideas. So yeah, you've gotten just a taste of the content that's out there.
Well, my first point that I put up here was that abductive reasoning, as you explained it, does sound a lot like a sophisticated form of what they refer to as just so stories. I want to point out here, not there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but it does seem like a fact that needs to be acknowledged. Making up a story to fit the facts, and just find the one that fits best.
Yeah, and I think in some respects it is the case. It is not induction where you could predict probabilities and test them. It doesn't follow with certainty. It is an attempt to come up with the best explanation, and to some degree, it could be thought of as kind of a just so story. But there are means of kind of working through them. Which of them are coherent? Which of them have better explanatory power and scope? And so I think there is a way of moving away from a misuse of abductive reasoning, but it's not perfect, and plausibility is different than probability and certainty.
Yeah, we had a speaker a short time ago explain the difference between experimental science and forensic science, and he was saying that he was more the forensic scientist, just examining what's left over and trying to work it out, which similar sort of line to your abductive reasoning.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about about scientists. I mean, I work with them, and when they have detailed discussions, I get lost in the weeds. But what I often like to do is I try to understand kind of the broad categories of thought. And I think that scientists really, even though science is primarily an inductive enterprise, scientists at times think deductively, they think inductively, they think abductively. And I think abduction is a very important part of how they develop their hypothesis.
Just on that, you know, normally when you say something is a just so story, that's normally not a that's not a compliment to the theory, right?
That's right, right.
Yeah,
It's a
normally
negative.
is.
So it doesn't normally doesn't normally a just so theory or just so story normally fall prey to Occam's razor, because you've got to keep inventing things and you don't have that it never has the test, it never passes the test of simplicity though, right?
Well, that's basically what science does. So if you think about it, it creates this story to explain the observed facts. It does some experiments, discovers some more facts, and modifies the story to fit the more facts that they've got. This is kind of something that I kind of tweaked to when I was in my third year of physics at university. That's largely what a lot of science appears to be doing. I mean, once again, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, even though, as you pointed out, we normally assume that a just so story is something that's not right. I just feel that it's something that we need to acknowledge that this is how we're doing it.
And I think that there are ways of moving away from kind of the negative. I mean, a negative just so story might be an explanation that involves ad hoc. I just kind of invent things out of thin air as possible explanations. Whereas going back to those tests and looking at Occam's razor, is this a fully orbed explanation, and is it the simplest? And then I think as well, this idea of explanatory power, it explains things, and then it can explain a wide variety of things. Somebody like a Richard Swinburne, William Lane Craig, the same way with resurrection, C.S. Lewis about Christianity, that Christianity can explain why the universe looks as if it had a beginning, why it's fine-tuned, but it would also explain the human condition, why human beings are struggle the way they do. So you would have a broad range of explanation. But Brian, I think you're right. I think that science does that very thing. It develops these models and then works through them. It's interesting to me, nevertheless, that one of my philosophical heroes, Mortimer Adler, he said that by and large, scientists are highly specialized but not broadly educated. Now, I don't think that was an ad hominem on the part of Adler. I think he meant something very important, and that is that scientific training is so specialized. I mean, I've been in a room with 6 different types of physicists, and they're so specialized that sometimes there isn't even training in, logic and some of those kinds of things. And so I find science to be possibly the greatest invention that human beings, the natural science is one of the greatest enterprises human beings have come up with. And yet it's very limited. Who was it? Lawrence Krauss, an outspoken atheist. He's debated Bill Craig a number of times. I think one of them may have even been in Australia.
3 of them were in Australia.
3 of
They
them.
were circus.
There you go. Yeah, I remember watching them. Krauss has said that experiment is the final arbiter of truth. And I just couldn't believe when he said it, because that could never come from an experiment. That's a non-experimental assertion. And so science is a remarkable way of discovering truth about the empirical world, but it's very, very limited. And that's where other disciplines can come in and help us.
I agree with you, but you could get into big trouble with saying that.
That's true. Yeah.
That's less so now, and it's interesting because going back to that Krauss thing against William Lane Craig, and even with Hawking and stuff afterwards, they both pronounced that philosophy was dead, and the baton has passed to physicists, and then they both went on to write books about philosophy, badly, but that was what they both did. Of course, they made a lot of money. I think in Krauss's case, especially, that explains a lot.
Well, there was one physicist here in the States. He said, it doesn't help when you use low-grade philosophy to beat up on philosophy. And I think that's exactly right. Philosophy of science is a very sophisticated area. And many of these questions are more philosophy of science questions than they are science questions.
So as host, the host normally gets to ask the first question, and even though I'm being verbose now, that leads me to the question that I was going to save to later, my last comment, and then we'll get back to the order. This is really a fascinating question. You brought up the idea of falsifiability right at the end. And Sean Carroll, who's a particle physicist out of Caltech, although I think he's just recently moved, he has actually been saying that physicists and scientists should move away from the criteria really espoused by Karl Popper, I think, and the Vienna Circle guys, that a scientific theory needs to be falsifiable. And he's doing that, it seems, well, it's correlated, at least, if it's not cause, it's at least correlated with the increasing evidence for the origin of at least a universe and potentially a multiverse. And so it's interesting, if science goes with somebody who's influential like Sean Carroll and others, if they adopt a stance where their theories aren't falsifiable, and somebody like Sabine Ossenfelder would agree, particle physicist as well, what does that do for us in the philosophical world, good or bad? I mean, are you familiar with that? Oh, sorry, it's a long question. It's a long question, but I'm sorry, the background was necessary.
Yeah, right. I agree. There are many people who have raised questions about the multiverse, and many of the people who are physicists who have questions about it would say, Paul Davies says this, various other people say, look, if science is about observation, then we can't observe any of these universes. And if science is about falsification, then this is an unfalsifiable theory. Paul Davies would say, let's just call it what it is. It's philosophy. It's speculative philosophy. I don't doubt that there are people, and Sean Carroll for a number of years worked at Caltech, which is just down the freeway from Reasons to Believe. I think that there are questions about falsifiability. I mean, I think there are things you cannot falsify. I don't think the laws of logic can be falsified. In order to falsify anything, you have to assume the truth of the laws of logic. So I think there are, Tom, I think there are limitations to this question of falsifiability. But if there are rules of science, if these are part of the way the natural sciences are done, then things that cannot be observed or things that are not even conceivably open to falsification, they at least don't play according to the rules. Now, in terms of philosophy, well, I think that's where some philosophers would say, look, there are certain foundations upon which all knowledge are based. And I think the law of non-contradiction, for example, is a universal principle. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. And I think many of the people who are advocates of a Karl Popper approach, they find some of these modern ideas like a multiverse to be strange, to be odd. Hugh Ross, I think I could say that Hugh Ross, he pushes very hard for the idea of falsification. He doesn't think if something is at least not open to a conceivable capacity to be falsified, he would say that's not science. So no, I'm very glad you raised that. And I think there are limitations to falsification. I just think that it's a very powerful, practical way of saying, okay, could you give me a scenario where your conspiracy theory would commit something that would show it to be false? And my own experience is that the vast majority of times I've asked that question, most people who embrace big government conspiracy theories could never conceive how they're viewed. It's almost a faith proposition.
Okay, thanks, Ken. That's actually useful. Next, we had Derek and Eric. Do you guys want to pipe in with Sherlock Holmes? I think that's actually a fun, good question.
It's been probably 20 years since I read the books, but I thought there might have been some of each, because sometimes he was thinking of a explanation that would fit the observations, and sometimes he would see something that would make some explanations not work.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I think there are times when, there is the deduction, and I think that it's not really a deducing. I think Sherlock Holmes, by and large, was engaging in abductive reasoning. And I have a friend who is a cold case detective, very popular apologist here in the United States. And he talks about crime scene investigation. I think Sherlock Holmes was very much in the abductive tradition of what is the best explanation, and then going through a very careful process. Yeah, I think that's right.
And Derek, you had some interest about the Masons, and I guess plausibility of grand unified conspiracies.
Derek will need to enable his microphone.
Are you still with us, Derek? There you go. You need to unmute, which is a phrase that we've heard many times since 2020. Derek, maybe we'll come back to you. Okay.
I noted that a lot of people in leadership roles, political and other things, have been members of the Freemasons, and so that the fact that you have a lot of different sorts of elites at some point being in a room together to which most people don't have access, that that can lead people to be suspicious about what goes on there.
I think that's exactly right. I think we should grant the reality that there are times where things seem suspicious to us. And in American history, there has long been kind of secret societies. While the Catholic Church is often pointed to as the author of certain conspiracies, in American life, there were societies where Catholics were not accepted. And, it's not unreasonable to think, here's a Bill Gates who has billions of dollars. There are people around the globe that are very, very wealthy. They have particular ideologies. But I think what happens is they move from the suspicious to a very convoluted theory about how this group is kind of strangleholding the world. And so I think an initial suspicion about things like that, I don't have a problem with that. But I do want to look at the details. I want to look at the theory. And, I think as Christians, we should work hard to communicate to non-Christians that we think that truth is sacred. And if we make a mistake, we'll admit our mistakes. And we work hard at trying to discover the truth. It's not always easy to know what's true or how to reason through them. But in my opinion, many thoughtful non-Christians could benefit from seeing Christians in that light, rather than maybe a knee-jerk reaction to a conspiracy theory. And so I'm not surprised that people have certain suspicions, and I certainly grant there are plenty of people who think ideologically.
Okay. Eric, any more on that one? Not
Eric, you
hearing
need to
that.
unmute.
Yeah.
Except to, I suppose I could, the one thing I often think of with conspiracy theories is who's ever tried to organize a surprise party with lots of people attending? So I was invited to
one.
Oh yeah.
I ordered and I wanted a surprise birthday party for my next birthday. My wife pulled it off. She really did surprise me.
I'll tell you an interesting story. Years ago, I met Charles Colson. Charles Colson was one of the attorneys for Richard Nixon concerning the Watergate conspiracy. And Colson, of course, was arrested, prosecuted, did time in prison. And later, he became a Christian and started prison fellowship that has had a big influence in prison ministries. Well, Colson said that one of the reasons he thought the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus was convincing is that none of the inner circle of the apostles, ever broke and said, hey, there's something suspicious going on here. He thought that was very much supportive of the resurrection. And I think that's a really great question to ask. I mean, how many people would have to be involved in the conspiracy? And then how could you ensure that they wouldn't reveal the secret? It seems like human beings find it very hard to hold a secret. And then if you're guaranteed, if you could give a smoking gun that there was a second shooter, let's say on the grassy knoll, if you could actually prove that, think of the money, the fame, the opportunities that would be made available for something like that.
I have questions about that, but I'll try and be a good host and move on through everybody else. So, Steve, do you want to talk about the Soviet link to Oswald?
Sorry, yep, I'm just coming back in. Yes. Oh, look, I hear what you had to say, Ken. Yes, you're right. Oswald really was a nobody, but correct me if I'm wrong, he did actually defect to the Soviets for a while. I think he married a Soviet or a Russian girl. Obviously he was a bit of a no-hoper, then came back. but there was the Soviet background, which, you know, it does lead some credence to why he was the one guy that would have done it.
Yeah, Oswald is a fascinating figure. His brother Robert, it was a very interesting discussion from Robert Oswald. Lee Oswald moved around a lot. I think Oswald family lived in maybe 30 different places. His father died when he was very young. Oswald joined the Marine Corps on his 17th birthday, and he spent time actually here in California. He was at the Marine base here in El Toro, which is just down the freeway from RTB. And at one point, he became very disenchanted with America, with the American military, and he was able to move to Russia. Now, of course, he blackmailed them. They didn't want to let him in. He promised that he had secrets about American military that they might benefit from. And they said, look, we checked this guy out. And at first they thought he might be a spy from America. But then they discovered that, you know, he wouldn't be useful to us, even if we could make him a counter spy. But he slit his wrists in the hotel. And he kind of forced the Soviet government to kind of allow him to stay. He stayed there a couple years, and then he discovered that living in a totalitarian state in the late 1950s was not quite the paradise that he thought it may be. He married Marina, who was a Russian young gal. They had a couple children, then came back to the States. You know, here is my observation about Oswald. This is my take. Some might differ with it. I think one of the reasons why I don't think Oswald was a good assassin choice, a hitman, if you will. I think that Oswald was so disturbed emotionally that you could not get him to do anything that he didn't want to do. I think if you look at Jack Ruby, who was he had a kind of a strip joint there in Dallas, and he was a big Kennedy fan, and he liked to invite the police over, and he pulled out his pistol and shot Oswald. I don't think a professional organization would ever pick somebody like Oswald or Jack Ruby for a hit. When just a couple minutes before Ruby shot Oswald, he was at the Western Union office sending a MoneyGram to one of his employees, and he left his dog in the car. I don't think Oswald, I don't think the mob or some other clandestine group would have ever picked Oswald or Jack Ruby, and even the rifle. Now, the rifle was reliable. It was a World War II carbine, and many expert riflemen shot it later and said it was a reliable rifle, but Oswald bought it for $13. I don't think Oswald and Ruby are the kind of people anybody would pick to be professional hitmen.
Okay. Now, look, I just thought you had omitted to say that he'd been to Russia, and I thought, look, I'm going to bring that up
Sure.
anyway.
Of course, yeah. No, it's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
The Reasonable Faith brothers in our second frame from the left are next. With how are these factors shown to fit for good theory? Sorry, I don't quite have the context.
Yeah, okay. You said that one of the conspiracy theories was true, which was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So you produced all these 6 factors. Like, how would you say that these 6 factors worked effectively to say that that was actually a genuine conspiracy or true conspiracy?
Well, what's interesting about the case is that there are unanswered questions. A particular woman who ran the pub where this group of individuals met to plan the assassination, she was convicted of conspiracy and she was hanged. And there are many people who think that she was railroaded, that that there was a sense of, you know, the people who were looking to prosecute, they wanted to show a strong force against this. So I'm not suggesting that a courtroom is always the perfect arbiter of determining truth. But there was eyewitness testimony, and you know, this was a public event that happened at Ford's Theater. There were people who knew John Wilkes Booth, and that night they also attempted to kill other members of Abraham Lincoln's staff. So there was the capacity to be able to say, you know, to raise particular questions. Who were these people? What are the facts? Are there good reasons to question these types of things? And I would raise the Watergate issue. I think it's a mistake to think that conspiracies can never happen. And at least there was a small conspiracy to murder Abraham Lincoln, and they were successful.
I've also got another comment. Like, you've considered abductive reasoning associated with conspiracy theories, and all these principles that you've outlined seem great for assessing other things than conspiracy theories. And we've had Tom's comment about the multiverse. So I think that's a great thing to actually have in your toolkit for assessing many other things.
Well, I think where there is good application of abductive thought with regard to conspiracies is in the sense that conspiracy theories are alternative theories of explanation. And abductive reasoning raises the question of what is the best explanation? What is a good explanation? How can I test a good explanation? And I think it places us within a context where we can start asking, what makes a good explanation? And so in some sense, I'm using good ways of reasoning to kind of contrast potential bad ways of reasoning.
Okay. All right. Well, that's to the end of the chat, I think. Unless, Brian, did you have anything else to add? I think we touched on the falsifiability. Did you have anything?
Yeah, there was another one I put in there, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I put in later during this discussion. You're talking about having debates, discussions or whatever with major conspiracy theorists, and then you ask them to present a reason why, or some way that their theory could be falsified, and they are stumped. My thinking there is, if that was me put on the spot, I also would be stumped. And if they were able to go away and think about it for a few days, they could probably come back with a good answer. But of course, by then it would be too late for your discussion. Is that worth considering?
Yeah. Look, I've done enough debates, impromptu debates, and always driving home, I'm thinking, I could have said this, or I should have said that. I certainly agree with that, but let me push it a little bit. Some of these people have written books over decades about these various issues. I think people who have that kind of investment, why weren't they exposed to these kinds of questions? And do they even approach the subject with these kind of ideas in mind. So yeah, I don't expect an average person to necessarily come up with an answer on the spot. But if you've written multiple books and done, so many interviews and even done documentaries, I would expect that those people would, I think they should be expected to give us a reasonable answer.
I think should is the correct word there, yes.
Mm. But it may take some time and not be done.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember my father was a combat soldier. My dad came from West Virginia, which is a state where there's a lot of rifles and hunting. My dad initially thought maybe there was a conspiracy. But after reading and thinking and reflecting, I came to the conclusion about 30 years ago, I said, I think Oswald was the lone assassin. I think the Warren Commission was basically correct. Wasn't a perfect commission, but it was the largest police investigation of a crime in history. And again, there's an interesting idea. You have Chief Justice Earl Warren. He chooses 2 representatives out of Congress, 2 senators. They're both Democrat and Republican. He has a former leader of the CIA. He has a leader of the American Bank. Now, would the Supreme Court Justice of the United States be willing to risk his reputation and lie to the American people about an assassination? I mean, he's going to go down in history. I mean, these are questions I think we need to ask. And let me make a more critical point. Let's suppose all these conspiracies are wrong. And what does it say when people say, well, Lyndon Johnson, a former president of the United States, conspired to murder his own friend, John F. Kennedy? You may not like George Bush, but to say that he knew, that he conspired to allow for 3,000 Americans to be murdered. It seems to me that if you are making these kinds of accusations, you need to put up or shut up. And I think that there are times where, look, we all like to speculate, but I find it very difficult to think that the Chief Justice of the United States would be willing to risk his reputation and to lie to the American people. Is it possible? I guess it is. I don't think it's plausible at all.
I want to give you a counterpoint to that I can't resist. Moscow today. Why would our leader lie to us about the war in Ukraine? And why would it be plausible to think that he's actually lied to us, and all of our government officials and our army and our forces have all lied to us and led us down the wrong path? Why would it be feasible? Why is that? Aren't we having a presupposition that that's feasible in Russia, but it's not feasible in the US?
Well, I would say this. I think that there is a difference. I think if you take a totalitarian state, and you can look at Russia today and ask, well, what is that government like in compared with the old Soviet Union? And I think it's reasonable to conclude that Putin learned a great deal from his time in the Soviet Union. I also don't think that that Russia, even today, even though it is a modern country with lots of economic resources and the second largest number of nuclear weapons, I don't think that they have the kind of freedom of the press that you have in other countries in Europe, that you have in America. Again, it's not to say, I mean, in America, I guess I would put it this way. I think that it is possible that a government could attempt to conceal things, to cover up things. But you know, the job of a media, and this concerns me. It concerns me in my own nation. I think that democracies depend deeply on having very good journalists who ask very difficult questions, journalists who are not ideologues in themselves, but are willing to ask everybody and anybody these types of questions. Not having a good, a sound press, I think, does contribute to the possibility of clandestine types of things. But I think in major democratic circles, there is still the capacity to, it would be very difficult in my mind to cover up many of those things. Impossible? No, I wouldn't go that far. Now again, Tom, may I bring you back to my own theory? I hope my theory is not a conspiracy theory. I hope it's just
just let me interrupt to say I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Of course, yeah.
Because I think we've got to, you know, what's good for the goose has got to be good for the gander, and I think it provides us a really good question. But can I just guide you a little bit, sharpen the question a little bit?
Of course.
From inside Moscow, how would you judge that?
Yeah.
You see, the question you're giving it a perspective from a West Coast in the US with thinking, and we all know the problems with the press and media and stuff these days. But so from inside of Moscow, why is it more or less plausible? Like, why would you think it more or less plausible that there could be a plot?
Well, again, I think that Putin's. I question whether Putin is a freely elected individual. I question. I think I have a reasonable right to question whether the political theories that come out of Moscow have escaped that totalitarian force. Is Putin up to being voted out of office? Is that a real viable option? I still think, I mean, I think of Nazi Germany, the kind of conspiracy theories and control of things within a totalitarian state, I think is very different than democracies. Now, I will say this. I think one of the fundamental problems with democracies is every generation or two, democracies fall asleep and then they wake up to the fact that there are totalitarian forces who would like to take our freedom away. I think the British slept while Hitler rearmed. I think America has done the same thing. I think democracies, we're lazy. We don't like war. We want to enjoy our lives. But inevitably, those countries, and I have great admiration for Australia. I just think Australia has this sense of being tough-minded, independent. That's why I think Australia has been such a great ally to the democracies of the West. But Tom, I think conspiracy and control is much easier in a country that has a long tradition of totalitarianism.
And if I may just butt in there, thanks, Ken. I personally am very affronted. Hitler came to power in 1933. By that stage, Stalin had killed how many millions? A lot more in Ukraine, what, 3, 4, I don't know. I don't know the figure. He didn't count the numbers. The German Teutonic efficiency, they counted the people they killed. We all knew about, the Red Terror that happened after the Bolshevik Revolution. We then saw the trials where people confessed, I did this, I did that, and they were taken out and shot. And yet we then go and say, okay, you're our allies. Hollywood made a big star. Oh, Uncle Joe. I'm sorry, we in our democracies can easily be blinded and overlook the evil that is in the world. And then we ourselves are self-delusional by deliberately ignoring the two bad. I think it was Churchill who said, I'd rather make a treaty with Satan in order to defeat Hitler. I mean, yes, he made that choice, but it seemed that so many people were deluded about how bad it was on the left-wing side of politics at that stage. So, yeah,
I can't dispute that. I think that I think you're right. Of course, I'm very sympathetic, I think, to presidents or leaders who have to leave during war. I mean, you have Franklin Roosevelt, and of course, Churchill thought Roosevelt, was kind of won over by Stalin. And yet I would raise the question, there was this great threat. And, Germany was a powerful military, so was Japan, less so with the fascist Italy. But the Allies defeated this threat in 44 months. How long has America been in Afghanistan? How long were we in Vietnam?
Yes.
I think the Allied leaders, with all of the mistakes they made, they pulled off almost a miracle.
Yeah. Look, I'll just state something. Nixon actually got the North Vietnamese to come to a peace conference. Was it in the Paris Peace Accord? Because he finally took the gloves off and sent in the B-52s over Haiphong and mined the harbour. And so you have to be tough with these guys. And unfortunately, we cannot win. Look, I was Air Force at the time. You cannot pretend to do it in half measures. That's what they did in the Second World War. They sent the B-29 or the B-17s and etc. over Germany and bombed them into submission. Unless we take the gloves off, we can't do it half measures. Anyway, I'm getting off this subject, so I'll hold my point now.
Yeah, that's probably a little bit, probably straight into it.
Because while I don't disagree with a lot of things that have been said, all this about politics and everything and the systems of the world and so on, what we're about here is applying abductive logic and that to matters of Christian faith. Really, I mean, these have been illustrative things, I know, to demonstrate how abductive reasoning works and everything. But we're talking about arguments that people make against the Christian faith and how we go about defending the Christian faith. That's what reasonable faith is all about. And so I do think we're getting off the track, to be frank.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. But the question was, how do we, if government conspiracies are possible, how do we, and generally false, I think, Ken, that would be your thesis, that they're generally false, and you've offered us ways to critique them.
Yeah, I'm very suspicious of them. Yes.
Yeah. But so the question to the topic is basically how do we critique them from the inside? That was really the thrust of my question.
Yeah.
So
and Tom, I think it's a fair question. I think I would still insist that that I agree with the point that's made earlier. Courage is a very rare trait in life. Aristotle said that courage is the virtue that guarantees all others. If you are not courageous, you're going to have a very hard time being virtuous in any meaningful way. Nevertheless, Tom, I'm still going to come back to the point that I think that the weaknesses, even in the Western democracies, that there is still a freedom and a capacity to second guess and to question that does not, in my mind, exist in Russia today.
Yeah, fair enough. That's fair. And sorry, let me. I'm monopolizing here. I'm trying not to, but I'm failing. So anybody else?
I just want to say with regard to Ken's last statement that there are different levels of that. So far in our society right now, it's not, we don't have the same level of freedom that we used to in the past. Russia at the moment has greater freedom than they did in the past. And there are other countries like China and North Korea that are much more restrictive. So it's kind of like a range rather than a yes, no.
I think that's a fair point.
Okay. Can I ask a question, Tom?
Please.
Yeah. You sort of touched on it a bit in the presentation. Does biblical prophecy, particularly those in the Book of Revelation, make Christians vulnerable to error and conspiracies?
I wrote a little book entitled Christian Endgame, and I intentionally did not argue from my point of view. What I did in the book is I looked largely at premillennialism, amillennialism, and postmillennialism, and I identified what I thought were the strengths of those views and the weaknesses of those views. And I also raised questions that are very challenging, like the proper interpretation of apocalyptic literature, the fact that there is consensus on eschatology, what I would call mere Christian eschatology. I mean, all conservative Christians believe there will be a second coming, that Christ will raise the dead, that he will judge humanity, that there will be a new creation and an eternal state. I call this mere Christian eschatology. That gets almost no discussion. What gets discussion is the timing of the rapture, the nature of the millennium, and then there are all of these people making date setting, very popular in America. I think if I were a non-Christian, I would love that. I would say, oh, wow, so the Bible's wrong again. What I tried to do in the book is I said, look, I think eschatology is a challenging area of Christian theology. I think one should proceed cautiously. I think we should also be generous to people who disagree with us, because there really is no ultimate consensus about the millennium and these kinds of things. In America, the 20th century has seen a revival of premillennialism, and I think many Christians are taught that there will be a one world government. And again, I've followed this. I remember in the 1970s, the Antichrist was going to come out of Europe. It may be a Russian, it may be somebody out of the Western Europe. I was at an event in Christmas Eve, 1979, where Hal Lindsey, who wrote the book, The Late Great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey said, will Christ come in the 80s? Hal Lindsey says, yes. Other people have done the same thing. Chuck Smith, the leader of the Calvary Chapel movement, very popular in America, essentially said Jesus was going to come in 1988. Now, today, that same group is saying, no, the Antichrist will be a Muslim. I'm like, wow. I think that often Christians are exposed to a very narrow range of interpretation of apocalyptic literature. And premillennialism was very popular very early in church history. It largely disappeared, and postmillennialism became popular. Amillennialism became popular. And I think the 20th century has seen a revival of premillennialism. What I really attempt to do is to say, is there reason to be somewhat cautious when it comes particularly to the speculative areas of eschatology? I think it's reasonable to conclude certainly amillennialists and premillennialists agree that there will be a period of suffering, a period of trial that will be part of the end. Now, the postmillennialists, they differ with that. They see that last 1,000 or so year Christianity will dominate the earth and it will usher in the second coming. I would simply say, I don't think speculative eschatology should lead you to conclude that, or to have an excessive speculation or distrust of government. You know, I think all of us have suspicion about a government. I mean, America was kind of birthed on that. I have found it very interesting thinking about Queen Elizabeth. You know, England was America's first enemy. And of all things French, the French were our allies. And yet the remarkable events over the last couple hundred years where England, America, Australia, I personally think that you're right. Roosevelt made lots of mistakes. Even the great Churchill made mistakes. I think Stalin was one of the most evil men in the world. But I really think that the World War II generation of my country, your country, and many other countries, I think they saved the world. I think if Hitler and the fascist Japanese had won, you know, Wikipedia today says 78 million people died in World War II. When I was a kid, it was 50 million. Lots of information's been revealed about China and the Soviet Union. What would have happened had the Axis won that war? I think the whole world would be a prison camp. And I think that I think we should encourage Christians to be careful and to be cautious. Premillennialism may prove to be right, but I don't think it should lead us to have an irrational distrust of government.
Kevin, time check. I know it's around about 2:20 a.m. for Ken here, and I'm not sure what you're planning from here. Do you?
I think at this point we can terminate the recording, and I think that's good enough for you. So yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Ken, and I'll just stop the recording now.
Well, I just want to say how much I appreciate.
Sorry. Oh, right.